A very warm welcome to St Paul's Cathedral. My name is Paula Gooder. I'm Canon Chancellor here at St Paul's, which means that I am the Director of the Learning Department and also of St Paul's Cathedral Institute. And now, it causes me immense pleasure to introduce you to our speaker tonight. Diarmaid MacCulloch is an academic, a historian, a broadcaster, and an author. He is Emeritus Professor of the History of the Church at Oxford University and the author of numerous prize-winning books. Diarmaid is a hugely influential Reformation historian, and when my team and I were discussing who we might wish to invite to talk about the influence of Tyndale during the time of the Reformation, we basically said there is one person that we would like to ask. And fortunately for us, he said yes. So we are delighted that Diarmaid is prepared to come this evening and talk to us about the influence of Tyndale on the Reformation period. As I've said already, Diarmaid has written many influential books in this area. One of the most significant is his book, The Reformation, A History, which is a great read, and I recommend it to you highly. But you will discover this for yourself very shortly, as Diarmaid tells us about Tyndale and his influence on the Reformation. So can I ask you to join me in welcoming Diarmaid MacCulloch?
Thank you, Paula, and thank you all for coming tonight. This is a very appropriate place to talk about William Tyndale for all sorts of reasons. The very year we're in, 2026, is the anniversary of the first complete New Testament of the Reformation in this country. 1526, William Tyndale published the entire New Testament. And St Paul's Cathedral Library is home to just one of 3 surviving copies of that edition. If you were to turn your heads round and look west, perhaps a little awkward in your seating, you would be looking in the direction of the place where England's printers and booksellers gathered already their businesses in the time of William Tyndale. But that little New Testament was not among the books you would find on their shelves in 1526. And it could not be printed by the printers behind you in London. Instead, it was, to begin with, burned outside this cathedral in that direction, burned by the order of the Bishop of London. And it is likely that the vast majority of the cathedral staff and a large crowd of Londoners would have been cheering Bishop Tunstall on as the flames rose from that heap of Bibles. Well, times have changed. There will be an exhibition this summer in the cathedral library, and there you will see this book. This book will be on display, and what will immediately surprise you is how small it is. It is very small, and that reflects the same situation. This and every other copy of the printed English New Testament in the 1520s had to be kept out of sight, and you would need to thrust it deep down in the Tudor equivalent of your pockets in order to hide it. At home, you would have to hide it. Now, you will remember one of Jesus' parables in the New Testament, which gives us the image, a very precise image, for the effect of that tiny book. An image, naturally, beloved of Protestants over the centuries. the mustard seed. Tyndale's words of translation are these, I quote, "A grain of mustard seed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs and is a tree, so that the birds of the air come and build in the branches of it." As you'll know, that's Matthew chapter 13. So one tiny book is a mustard seed for the English Reformation. Now, Jesus did not leave us a saying on the holy hand grenade of Antioch. That was Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But we can lay alongside the gospel mustard seed parable the hand grenade image, because the books which make up the Bible speak with a multitude of voices. In countless different situations throughout the centuries, these books can explode with a destructive force. And I speak of books and not a book, because the Bible is not a book. Remember that its original name in Greek, is not the Greek equivalent of book in the singular, but books in the plural. Books, biblia. The Bible is a library of books, even if they gather under a single cover these days. The Bible reaches us as a babble of voices about God. William Tyndale was a scholar in a marginal part of medieval Europe, listening and trying to make sense of the great holy cacophony about God that lies between the covers of the Bible. In English, it was Tyndale who shaped that babble into the language of the people so that they could hear it for themselves. When we read Tyndale's versions of the Bible, it's possible that we may hear the same things that he heard. But every reader of the Bible has that same task of reading and listening. There is no one way to hear everything in the Bible. No one single message to extract from Biblia. It is the joy and privilege of every reader in every century to hear it afresh. And we can do that with William Tyndale's help. Tyndale's hope was to present the English with a complete Bible, Hebrew Scripture and New Testament. But the worldly and spiritual power of his day had him killed before he could finish his task. What he left us is a poignantly incomplete masterwork, an unfinished symphony, whose whole shape, eventual shape, was the work of some very talented helpers. It's sad that we only have one letter surviving from William Tyndale, but it could not be a more appropriate survival. It comes from the last year of his life in prison in the Low Countries, and it is a plea to his jailer to give him the tools of his scholarly trade in his prison cell as he struggled to complete his translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. I quote, "Permit me to have my Hebrew Bible, Hebrew grammar, and Hebrew dictionary, that I may spend my time with that study. And in return, may you obtain your dearest wish, provided always it be consistent with the salvation of your soul." Remember, he's writing to his jailer. How would it come to this for Tyndale? Officially strangled to death in a prison in a foreign land, and his body then burned to ashes. Why were his New Testaments so threatening that they were thrown on the fire like their translator's body? so explosive in the minds of their readers? It was simply the act of translation which mattered, and it mattered especially in Tudor England. It wasn't that the official church hid the Bible altogether from the life of Henry VIII's subjects, but in England, the only available Bible was already a translation from the original in an entirely different language, Latin. This Latin Bible was called the Vulgate, which is a Latin word which ironically means common to everyone. Well, it had been common to everyone in 4th century Rome, but a millennium later, no longer everyone needed to learn Latin to read the Vulgate. Latin was the language of power in church and society. For centuries, that left a large section of European society, those without power or education, stranded at more than one remove from the biblical text. This offended the great Renaissance scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, whom Tyndale hugely admired. But when Erasmus deplored the problem of a restricted Bible, he spoke in the medium of elegant Latin. Erasmus did know what needed to be done. You must go behind the Vulgate, back to the original Greek of the New Testament, and translate it again into Latin. Now that was indeed a huge achievement, because it freed those who read Latin to catch the meaning of the ancient Greek text without the voice of the official church intervening. When the kernel of the Christian message, the New Testament, was newly traced back to its original Greek, this inevitably raised questions about the Western Church, the Catholic Church if you prefer, which discussed the Bible in Latin. If there is any one explanation why the Latin West experienced a Reformation and the Greek-speaking churches to the East did not, it lies in this simple shock of a new and more immediate way of hearing the Bible text. Erasmus retranslated Greek words into Latin in different ways from the Vulgate. Not all his suggestions were good ones, but some of the best of them were a direct challenge to the Western Church and its authority. Perhaps most significant and an inspiration to the Protestant reformers came from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 2, where Matthew's Greek has John the Baptist shouting to the crowds listening to him, metanoite. And this metanoite word was repeated elsewhere in the New Testament. Now, Jerome and his Latin readers heard that as a demand to do penance. John the Baptist had stood there in the desert shouting at them, do penance, do penance. And that handily supported the idea of the sacrament of confession and penance as one of the 7 sacraments of the Western Church, which they had invented, let's say, in the 12th century. Erasmus pointed out that metanoite really means a change of heart. Have a change of heart, a conversion of life. So John is not just telling people to go to a priest to confess, do good works, do penance. It's much more personal and basic than that. And that is what Protestants from Luther onwards, and Tyndale among them, took up from Erasmus. They saw such misreadings in the Latin Vulgate a sign of the distortion of the original gospel message for the church's own purposes, whatever they might be. One of those who had enough Latin to profit from this sort of insight is perhaps unexpected, for he doesn't have the reputation of a scholar. This was the great statesman of the English Reformation, Thomas Cromwell, about whom I've written. He was much the same age as William Tyndale, and at first sight, Cromwell's career looks startlingly different from Tyndale's. Hard-nosed politician, Henry VIII's fixer. They do not look slightly more alike now that we know that Thomas Cromwell attended lectures in the University of Padua while he was wandering in Italy as a young man. Now, Cromwell would have needed decent Latin to go to those lectures, and in the end, Cromwell's Latin changed his life. He read Erasmus's Latin New Testament on a long journey from England to Rome, where he had been sent to bargain with the Pope for the benefit of Boston Parish Church in Lincolnshire, a mighty building that many of you will know, rearing its stupendous tower over the fens. Cromwell told friends later that his holiday reading of the New Testament on the way to Rome and back turned round his thinking, metanoete, turned round his thinking on traditional Christianity. And that is what pulled him towards the Reformation as it took shape in the 1520s. And so it was too with Tyndale, even though his life looked so different from Thomas Cromwell's. Tyndale was inspired to his own special task, his very own special task, to jump from Greek via Erasmus's Latin into Tudor English. And that was for a very special reason, peculiar to Tudor England. Erasmus was the cosmopolitan scholar from the Low Countries who wandered through most of continental Europe and even the far island of England. Erasmus knew well that right across the European mainland, Europeans enjoyed many translations of the Vulgate into local languages. By the end of the 15th century, in High or Low German, Italian, French, Dutch, Spanish, Czech, and Catalan. But they were not really Erasmus's business. And it was a different story in Tudor England and medieval England before it. The islands where English was spoken were different, indeed uniquely disadvantaged. There was no available version of the Bible in English for most people. Tyndale was remembered as confronting one senior clergyman in a much more personal and radical cry than Erasmus managed. If God spare my life ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough shall know more of the Scripture than thou dost. Tyndale didn't expect the ploughboy to learn Latin or Greek. He was a scholar who would create a text that anyone in England could hear and read. Now, this special problem of England with the Bible had started 150 years before Tyndale produced his revolutionary little book. In the latter half of the 14th century, a priest scholar and philosopher called John Wycliffe was, like Tyndale, a member of my own university, Oxford. Wycliffe sparked a dangerous wave of anger against the official church far beyond the University of Oxford. What angered his followers was the very success of the 14th century church in England. It was one of the best run parts of the Western or Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church seemed to satisfy the needs of the vast majority of the English church people. But Wycliffe thought that this success had been bought at the expense of Christ's teaching. This church was abusing the purpose of clerical ministry, corrupted by worldly wealth and power. But you could only demonstrate this to people by comparing the English church as it was with the Bible that it claimed as its own property. Wycliffe wanted everyone to have the power to compare. The only way to show how far the church had drifted from pure Christianity was to give English speakers a Bible in their own language, without the filter of Latin. So Wycliffe had encouraged his followers in a mammoth project of Bible translation. And what they did was to translate the Vulgate into the vernacular, the English of lowland England. Those who took up Wycliffe's condemnation of the official church were abusively nicknamed Lollards, a sneer that seems to mean mumblers of nonsense. And to cut a very long story short, the Lollards lost out in late medieval England. It wasn't just that the church suppressed their hatred of medieval Catholic era. The Lollards backed the losing side in national politics. Yet even in their defeat, crushing them set a pattern for English religious life. The English church authorities, the bishops, were so traumatized by the Wycliffe episode that in 1407, a council of bishops, the Bishop of London, of course, included, banned all versions of the Bible in English. Actually, there was only one such Bible, the Bible that the Lollards had freshly created. And the English church authorities did not provide a substitute. For more than a century afterwards, only the most obviously ultra-respectable and pious people in England could get away with open possession of the vernacular Bible, which was the Lollard Bible. And they wouldn't have thought of it as a Lollard Bible, just the Bible in English. I have seen the will of one of those ultra-respectable knights of the realm in 1496, leaving his English Bible to a friend who was a conscientious and rich archdeacon. Those sort of people could get away with it, but no one else. Tyndale would have been furious that you had to be rich, preferably with a coat of arms, to read the Bible in your own language. Yet there were two reasons why it would not be enough somehow to break through the class barrier and widen the circulation of the Lollard Bible from the 14th century. Most importantly, the Lollards had simply translated a translation from the Latin of the Vulgate into Midlands English. So that meant a double filter on the meaning of a text that had started life in Hebrew and in Greek. Second, Tyndale well knew that a century and a half from the time of John Wycliffe, the English language had moved on a great deal, and most of the country would find it difficult to understand the Lollard Bible. He made that clear when he printed one medieval Lollard tract, which had been written more than a century before his own time. He told his readers in his own little introduction to this tract that he had updated its Middle English into the Tudor English of the Thames Valley. Not quite how he put it, but that's what it was. But he also explained that he was going to publish this Lollard pamphlet in the original medieval form for a very good reason. He explained that people in the north of England and Scotland would understand the original text better than his updating in his fancy southern dialect. This was a man who knew how language worked and what its power might be. There lay Tyndale's particular genius. We've learned a lot more about his life in the last few years, and one basic revision may be especially important. William Tyndale came from Gloucestershire. He was a Gloucestershire man. And we thought we knew where he'd come from in Gloucestershire. If you know the scarp of the Cotswold Hills sweeping down to the Vale of Gloucester, you'll probably know the big Victorian tower, which looks appropriately like a lighthouse because it celebrates the life and birthplace of William Tyndale. But alas, the tower is probably in the wrong place. We should all have noticed that the great Reformation historian John Foxe, in his Book of Martyrs, said that Tyndale was brought up on the borders of Wales. And that does not sound like the Cotswolds. Gloucestershire is a big county, and in the west, in fact, absolutely on the borders of Wales, is the Forest of Dean. And there it is in the Diocese of Hereford. And we duly find that at the right time, William Tyndale, alias Hutchins, was ordained deacon in the Diocese of Hereford. So his early life should be moved across the River Severn, from the Cotswolds and the Vale of Berkeley and Gloucester to the very different Gloucestershire of the Forest of Dean, independent-minded, fiercely self-contained. Interestingly, also in Tyndale's boyhood, an area, a long-standing stronghold of the Lollards. All that fits John Foxe's remark very neatly. And if we do shift the young Tyndale to the Forest of Dean, think of the importance of the move to the future of this Bible translator. In the marketplace at Chepstow or St. Breville's, the boy Tyndale would hear the sounds of Welsh, a bafflingly different language from his own English. Was it this experience which made him so fascinated by translating words? Once he'd made his great decision on seeking out the Bible's earliest meanings behind the lattice window of the Vulgate, he would need language after language. First, he painfully learned Greek and Hebrew, the second of which he pursued while he was also learning German and Dutch so that he could survive on the run from England. All this so that he could translate the Word of God for the English. There's even some evidence that he could read the Quran in Arabic, at least enough to encounter it without the filter of a condescending medieval Latin translation. So Tyndale became a gourmet of language. On one occasion, he observed that the grammar and syntax of Hebrew fitted far more comfortably into English than it did into Latin. Another good reason for an English Bible. And he would bless his luck that he could use two good Anglo-Saxon words, gospel and worship, when biblical translators into other languages were stuck with Greek evangelion and Latin cultus. And he wrote English beautifully. That was simply a stroke of luck, or, if you prefer, the providence of God. And so began Tyndale's work, first translating the Greek of the New Testament into English, and then the Hebrew scripture, which Christians call the Old Testament. He approached Cuthbert Tunstall, Bishop of London, for support, and he was met with refusal and discouragement. He went on regardless. So he was defying the authorities in the English Church and Kingdom, that century-old ban on translation. His work must be done abroad, where there was in any case a far more advanced and sophisticated printing industry than in provincial, marginal England. In the Holy Roman Empire and the Low Countries, there was an extra advantage. Government was much more dispersed than it was in England, and that created useful layers of official confusion where Tyndale might slip past trouble. and others over there were able to provide the vital element that Tyndale lacked: money. Printers were after a profit, and not too worried about what they printed in order to get a profit. And there were sympathetic English merchants working the trade between England and mainland Europe who could provide the cash. The latest historian of the English Bible is Harry Spillane, and he makes a really important point about all this. Spillane says, between 1526 and 1534, Tyndale put none of his own money into the printing of his works, and so stood to gain nothing financially through their sale. Tyndale put his life at risk to translate his Bibles, but it was his financiers who put their livelihoods on the line to finance his controversial works. Out of all this, in 1525, the New Testament was ready. Tyndale arranged with a printer in Cologne to print it, but drunken printers leaked word to an alert Catholic writer. And so the news filtered back to England, to Henry VIII and his greatest minister, Cardinal Wolsey. A raid on the Cologne print shop stopped the presses at Matthew chapter 22. And now Tyndale fled once more, from Cologne this time, and traveled to printers further up the River Rhine. There he would have to start again. It was a year later, in the city of Worms, that Tyndale saw his New Testament translation finally into print. And this is the book that you can see in this cathedral. Now, Tyndale's modern biographer, David Daniel, thought that as many as 6,000 copies of the 1526 edition may have been printed. Little pocket-sized books shipped unbound down the Rhine, smuggled by ship into southeastern England. Those thousands of copies arrived in a kingdom of no more than 2.5 million people, with at that stage a very poorly developed market for books. So how did we get from those original thousands to just 3 copies? Many of them will simply have been read to pieces, especially if they were never given a binding. But not all, thanks to the Bishop of London, the same bishop whom Tyndale had approached for financial help. Cuthbert Tunstall did spend money on Tyndale's Bible project, but not to support it. Once he heard about the Testaments, and they started arriving in England, he and some of his fellow bishops bought up copies of it and burned them in a great bonfire only a few score yards from this cathedral. Tyndale's printers could use that money, handily, on reprints. So it was a thoroughly fruitless thing to do. And it was doubly foolish, because those texts which people did read changed the mood of a significant fraction of the English people. There are ways that we can gauge the effect of this literary smuggling. We can see it undermining respect for traditional Western Christianity during the 1520s, 1530s. We can chart the diminishing numbers of men putting themselves forward for ordination, priestly ordination, in the English church, or the dwindling sums of money that the public spent on the long-standing institutions which supported Catholic prayers for the dead. Many of those pounds and pennies now went instead on buying little illegal Bibles. And it's a tragedy of the early Reformation that some of the best minds of the Tudor Church spent so much effort on destroying English Bibles. Bishop Tunstall was a good and learned man, exceptionally cosmopolitan, a careful and subtle thinker, who in every other way was an admirable Bishop of London and then Bishop of Durham. And he was helped in his burning of Bibles by William Wareham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, another good and learned man, another scholar of the University of Oxford. We have a lot to answer for in Oxford. By the time of Tyndale's martyrdom in 1536, perhaps 16,000 copies of his translation had passed over the North Sea into England, despite all the efforts of the bishops. All the English Bibles created later were grateful to him and echoed his words. Even the Roman Catholic translation, made decades later, borrowed from Tyndale. And they all culminated in 1611, the publication of the new text commissioned by the 17th century king of Scotland, England, and Ireland, James VI and I. That's the work we call the Authorized Version, or the King James Bible. For 3 centuries after that, the Bible in English was essentially the King James Bible. But David Daniel's calculation was that 83% of the King James New Testament is Tyndale, exactly. And much the same is in the parts of the Old Testament that he actually wrote, translated. In the background was an ever-expanding Bible trade for what was now a Protestant nation. Another modern scholar, Ian Green, has calculated that in the 1630s, 10 times as many Bibles were being printed in England as had been published 50 years before. It really does appear to have been the case that the production of Bibles per head of the English population exceeded that of any other Protestant state in Western Europe. Beyond the particular conclusions about Christianity that Tyndale drew from his own reading, lay his unique and transformative achievement in language, his own English translation. On statistics alone, Tyndale triumphs, because he crafted shapes in the English language that lasted through a whole family of translations from Hebrew and Greek into this insular language that we speak here. Unbidden and without his name attached to them, these words rise to our tongues. Eat, drink, and be merry, the salt of the earth, the powers that be. In just the last decade of his life, Tyndale made the future of mainstream English culture a Protestant future for 4 centuries. In the 16th century, it would not have been obvious why this was so crucial to the world. England was not a significant world language in Tyndale's time outside the self-important little island kingdom of Henry VIII. But accidents of history have made Tyndale into a major cultural force right across the world, on the planet as it is. He is part of a decisive trio of Protestants from Tudor England who shaped the English that eventually spread across the globe. None of them met each other, but they stand together in our history. Besides Tyndale, we have Thomas Cromwell, the compiler of the Book of Common Prayer, and William Shakespeare. Their language is that which is now tapped into computer keyboards from Tokyo to Tierra del Fuego. Now there are countless millions who owe Tyndale a debt for his words alone. Tyndale undertook his translation at a crucial time for the English language. All European languages faced a testing time in the 16th century. European cultures were experiencing what the new technology of printing could do to languages. It would standardize the way they were written, and gradually from that, the way they were spoken. In addition, vernacular languages right across Europe faced a bombardment of new Latin words and even Greek words, because the European universities had found a new interest in ancient languages in the Renaissance. Because of this, people were fascinated by the possibilities of coining new words, receiving them into their own tongues. Anyone who was producing an influential text at that date was therefore making choices which would form the speech of generations. Tyndale, Cranmer, and Shakespeare, between them, did this for the English language. And from one small island off the European coast, their efforts have spread throughout the world. Tyndale would probably have been pleased, and no doubt also very surprised to know of this. Now, of course, Tyndale did not set out to be a cultural icon. He valued English because his own countrymen must meet the word of God in their own language, rather than relying on clergy to select fragments of the Bible for translating from Latin to suit clergy purposes. Everyone must find God's good news of salvation for themselves. Many from the old church wanted him dead, chiefly the enigmatic genius Sir Thomas More. The two men brought out the worst in each other, turning their language skills to cheap abuse and fruitless argument in print at enormous length. Neither More on Tyndale or Tyndale on More makes an especially pleasant read. The late Pope John Paul II declared Thomas More the patron saint of politicians, which is good news for politicians who weren't wont to burn people at the stake. Tyndale could never be a patron saint of politicians. He had no political sense. He alternately delighted and infuriated King Henry VIII, first by telling him to become head of the church, and then telling him to stick to Queen Catherine of Aragon and not marry Anne Boleyn. When King Henry wanted Tyndale back in England, the translator boldly laid down a condition. The king must make the Bible available to all his subjects in English. But no one told Henry VIII what to do. In the end, King Henry did nothing when the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V arrested the exile, and he left Tyndale to rot in a prison near Antwerp until the emperor chose to order his execution by strangulation and burning. And there was a network of expat Englishmen close to conservatives like Thomas More back home who had brought that result about. Yet the paradox is that Tyndale ended up doing more for the English Reformation than any politician in the Tudor age, but it was done in a silent partnership with Thomas Cromwell, the politician who also oversaw the downfall of Tyndale's enemy, Thomas More. Now that needs explaining. In the 1530s, Cromwell was one of the few people who could manage Henry VIII. And until recent years, Cromwell's usually had a bad press, not least because of a too realistic portrait from the artistic genius Hans Holbein. Now that portrait sits uneasily in a room in New York beside the picture of Sir Thomas More. Now, I think Holbein may have accentuated the positive rather a lot in Moore's picture, but his Cromwell comes across as a grumpy bureaucrat. But not many people remember the fact that this very picture was originally on the wall of Cromwell's own parlour in London. He clearly recognized himself. I think that shows admirable self-knowledge, maybe even a sense of humour. Okay, Cromwell was no plaster saint. But there was much more to him than some of the dismissive accounts that I read before meeting him for myself when I wrote a new life of him. What I found was a man genuinely caught up in the Reformation from that first reading of Erasmus's New Testament in the early 1520s as he set out on his mission to Rome for Boston Church. When Cromwell became the king's chief minister, he went on to risk his career to promote the Reformation cause. That is not the act of a cynical or selfish man. In the end, it may have been the crucial reason why Henry VIII destroyed his chief minister and brought him to the block on Tower Hill in 1540. Hidden most of all is Cromwell's relationship with William Tyndale. For very good reasons, that relationship is now almost invisible. But Cromwell may have been crucial in furthering Tyndale's cause, both in his years of exile overseas and after his death. Only a year or two after Tyndale had been executed with the connivance of King Henry, the same King Henry authorized a completed version of Tyndale's Bible to be placed in every church in his realm. That was the supreme achievement of Thomas Cromwell. Now, we have a great deal of incoming correspondence from Cromwell's personal archive surviving because it was confiscated and the king got it when he was arrested. Thousands on thousands of letters, which may make us think that they tell us all we need to know about Cromwell and those he knew. One of the reasons that we have virtually none of the letters that Tyndale wrote is that there is nothing from him in Cromwell's archive. I went through those thousands of letters, and I can tell you why the Tyndale ones are missing. They have been very carefully weeded out, like anything else that Cromwell or his secretaries thought might be dangerous if Henry VIII started looking at them as he did in 1540. You see, Cromwell and Tyndale were just too close for comfort. The circumstances of Tyndale's arrest and execution make that quite clear. You have to read between quite a lot of lines to see this reality. And that reality starts at least as early as the beginning of the 1520s, when both Thomas Cromwell and William Tyndale were for a while in the service of the Lincolnshire port of Boston. Both employments were odd in terms of their later history because they shout out traditional religion at you. Remember, Thomas Cromwell traveled to Rome on his major expedition to get privileges from the Pope for an indulgence sold by Boston Guild. That same Boston Guild took on William Tyndale as a chantry priest on a short-term contract, sole priest, if you like. Both Cromwell and Tyndale were learning a lot very quickly in those years. They could never have met after 1524, when Cromwell ceased to travel abroad and William Tyndale did go abroad into exile. But that didn't matter. Boston needs to reclaim its place in the early English Reformation. It is crucial. I point out to you that when Tyndale started publishing the New Testament, Boston was a provincial port which was a perfect route for smuggling illicit literature from its natural trading partners across the North Sea, the Low Countries. In Cromwell's years as Henry VIII's chief minister in the 1530s, the politician was also something of a smuggler. He was the agent responsible for restoring Tudor England's open access to vernacular Bible reading after the long ban imposed by the Catholic Church, the English Church. In his years of power under the king, Cromwell specifically encouraged the publishing of Tyndale's Bible text and its completion by Miles Coverdale and others. A complete turnaround in just a year or two, from burning the English Bible to making it official, a copy for every English parish church and church generally, cathedral. Tyndale and Cromwell were a team, even though Cromwell did not have the power to save Tyndale from his enemies either side of the Channel. We might indeed see the deaths of Thomas More and the great and saintly Bishop John Fisher and the other Catholic martyrs in part as Cromwell's revenge for the arrest and strangling of William Tyndale. Thomas Cromwell was by then using the powers granted to him by the king, the office which bore the clumsy title of vicegerent in matters spiritual. In effect, Henry VIII made him the replacement for Thomas Cromwell's late and much-loved master, Cardinal Wolsey. The vicegerent exercised the same powers for the crown that Wolsey had wielded for the Pope, but now with Cromwell's own personal twist. Cromwell's actions in the church from 1535 onwards is the ultimate answer to those who see him merely as a cynical politician. Even though he knew better than anyone how much King Henry had come to loathe Tyndale and how the king had played a part in Tyndale's destruction, Cromwell still continued to infiltrate Tyndale's translation into official publication without the king apparently noticing. Or maybe, in the end, in 1540, Cromwell's enemies did actually enlighten the king on this, when they saw that any negative perspectives on the doomed chief minister would usefully harden Henry's heart against him as both heretic and traitor. It may have been one of the many pretexts for Cromwell's royal master to decide on turning against him, just as he had turned against Tyndale. Most people from the past, before film and sound recording, are no more now than bundles of written words. We read what is written about them. We also often have some idea of how they looked. Not so with William Tyndale. The one portrait we have, treasured in his old Oxford College, was painted by someone who never met him. And it's simply a symbolic image, like a medieval saint's image, proclaiming him the first English Puritan, the embodiment of the English Reformation, grave, bearded, black-clad, self-contained. But we're compensated for this facelessness and the loss of all his letters by Tyndale's pioneering English words in the Bible. God did not spare his life in the Low Countries, but Tyndale has had an afterlife in more than one sense. That is what has brought you all here tonight, to honor his memory and celebrate the great success for which he gave his life. Thank you.
Diarmaid, thank you. That was, as I expected, absolutely fascinating. We've had a good number of questions come in already, but if you are opting for the old school version of writing your questions down on your programme, now is the moment to raise them up so my colleagues can come and collect them. And they will come and get them as we start exploring some of the questions. One interesting question is that some accounts of Tyndale make him sound like a rather stubborn and prickly person. Would you think that that would be an accurate description of him?
Yeah. Of course he was. He wasn't a sweet, reasonable guy. He wouldn't have gone to Cologne and left the country if he wasn't stubborn. He knew he had one thing to do. You know, you've got one thing to do, you do it. And he did it, nearly, as much as the authorities let him. So yeah, nothing wrong in being stubborn.
And then we've got a whole load of questions around translation. I want to kind of pick my way through them a little bit. Let's begin with the Lollard translation that you referred to as coming before Tyndale. Do we have any copies still of the Lollard translation?
Oh, we do, yes. Actually, a remarkable number. The Lollards survived in a curious position, sort of half in, half out, the old church. And they preserve these copies. Interestingly also, there are a lot of copies in the Czech Republic, because the queen of King Richard II was Anne of Bohemia. and links developed between the Lollards and the dissenting movement in Bohemia around Jan Hus, the Hussites. And so a lot of copies were smuggled over there to keep them safe, I think. So, yeah, we do have a remarkable number.
So the follow-up question to that is the Lollard translation any good?
It's fascinating. I do recommend it to you. The problem is, as I said, it's a translation of the Vulgate. It's not very satisfactory. It's what they could do, and they just didn't have the scholarly resources to go back to the Greek and Hebrew. Greek was virtually untaught in 14th century England. Hebrew a bit more, because scholars had to argue with Jews. And so they learnt Hebrew in order to sneer at Jews in the Hebrew language. But you couldn't have done it, really. Whereas in the 16th century, you have these already established at the universities, Oxford and Cambridge, quite a lot of Greek teaching, bit more Hebrew, particularly when Henry VIII wanted to look at the Bible to justify getting rid of Catherine of Aragon. You need to sort of look at all the Hebrew things about marriage and see if one of them will give you a get out. So in that, it's just a different situation. And you've got, of course, the great advantage of Erasmus giving you the Greek in a new way in Latin. So if you're a scholar, you can read that and be excited by it, as Thomas Cromwell was excited by it.
You've mentioned a couple of times Jerome's translation, the Vulgate, and the unflattering view of the Reformation translators that it wasn't very good. Do you want to kind of reflect a little bit on how good Jerome's translation was?
It's a work of genius. Jerome was an extraordinary scholar. He knew the Hebrew Bible extremely well. He knew the Syriac Bible, which is interestingly different in detail. And so he is working from Greek, Hebrew, Syriac in particular, to create a very remarkable translation into Latin. The only thing he's not reliable on, apart from these various theological things, such as I mentioned, the only thing he's not very reliable on is women. He had a very, let's say, interesting relationship with the female sex, and very often he will press on the meanings of words if there is a negative connotation for a woman. That's the only bits which have been picked up as really bad. And otherwise, he's picking and choosing, though, fascinatingly, between Syriac and Hebrew and Greek. Often he will make decisions in a particular direction, and they will decide the future.
So in a way, the key problem with the Vulgate, Jerome's translation, it was that it's the only one.
And it's a translation.
Yeah.
It's a translation. It's another filter between you and the original. And that's the problem. There is nothing else available. And when Roman Catholics tried to create an English Bible, as they did from the 1580s, they were stuck with a Vulgate. They translated the Vulgate, as well as borrowing nice phrases from Tyndale. So their Bible is not at the same level as any of the English Protestant translations. Still filtered.
One of the questions brings us greetings from Germany and asks to what extent Tyndale's translation was influenced by Martin Luther's translation of 1522.
Quite a lot to start with. Tyndale clearly admired Luther, and what he did in his Bibles was to put a little introduction to each of the books. And for instance, his introduction to Paul's epistle to the Romans is really Luther. But the fascination of Tyndale was that as he went backwards into the Hebrew scripture, he began thinking his own thoughts. Luther had rather sneered at Judaism and talked about the opposition between gospel and law. Law is the Hebrew scripture's way of dealing with God, and that's not as good as the gospel. But Tyndale began thinking, I'm not sure I believe that really. And so as he goes to what he did was go to the beginning of the Bible, take the first 5 books, which are, of course, the books of the law, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and so on. And his introductions to these books are his own. He abandoned Luther. He is thinking for himself, moving beyond Luther, as did the English Reformation. We did not have a Lutheran Reformation here. We had a Reformed Reformation, like the reforms of Geneva, John Calvin, Zwingli in Zurich. That's the basis of the Church of England at the present day, one may say.
One of the questions, a number of questions have come in around literacy rates, which seems quite an important question.
Yeah.
If the principle of the translators was to give people a Bible that they could read, how many could actually read it?
Moving target and also gender specific. Women's literacy is about 10% in the 16th century. Men, as you might expect, are much higher, but maybe 15% in Tyndale's time. But what's then very striking in the mid-16th century is how it leaps for most of the population. So by the end of the 16th century, most men, at least, are more or less literate. And of course, we need to remember that though you and I at school learnt reading and writing together, very often they didn't. They learned to read and to do a bit of basic writing, which means that if you've got a book like the New Testament, you can read it. And of course, you can also read it to your mates. You can read it in the pub to those who cannot read for themselves. So literacy is a complicated thing, but I think it's also one of the reasons why England became a literate society, except, it must be said, for the ploughboys. They remained 80% illiterate up into the 19th century. So reading became quite class-specific, but the small farmer, even some labourers could read, and then right up the social scale, by the end of the 16th century, the nobility could read completely and write.
And I feel the need to ask the follow-up question to that. To what extent was having a Bible in English, how did that contribute to reading rates?
I think very significantly indeed, like Scotland. You need, because Protestantism, a religion of the word, that means listening to a sermon from the pulpit and understanding it. So you need to have a certain degree of analytical thought in your head to do that. But you have the Bible, and you don't just hear it in church. You have your own Bible, which is cheaper than the big lectern Bible in the church. And this is what that scholar Ian Green noticed as the huge rise in Bible production, and therefore of Bible ownership during the later 16th, early 17th century.
If we just move on to the quality of Tyndale's translation, because there's a few around now which I think are interesting. Let's start with, if it had been a bad translation, if he hadn't been a wordsmith, what difference would that have made to the course of the Reformation?
That's a very interesting and rather difficult question, because, of course, he did shape the English language, but it's the way in which he could go for memorable phrases. I just quoted one or two at you, the powers that be. And the great thing is that on the whole, he avoided all this new Latin and Greek stuff pouring into vernacular languages during the 16th century. The pompous scholars' language. It's basically the English of the early 16th century, as an 8-year-old might learn it, a clever 8-year-old. But it's language which makes you laugh and cry. And Latin and Greek words don't make you laugh and cry. Try it out for yourself. The words which sort of bring a tear to your eyes and those which don't. And you use both sorts. So you can have a cordial reception, which is the same as a hearty welcome. But you see which is Anglo-Saxon and which isn't. So that's the good thing. Cranmer is the same. Cranmer really avoids pompous, scholarly words in English.
And in terms of that the quality and the poetic nature of Tyndale. One of the things that is often said about the King James Version and why people still love it is that it sounds nice.
Does sound nice, yeah. But of course, remember that in 1611, it also already sounded old-fashioned. That was quite deliberate on the part of the committee which compiled it. They did not want the Bible to be up to date. Why would it be? So they were happy with Tyndale's phrases. Occasionally they toned them down. He can be quite edgy sometimes in being vernacular. But that's, I think, enormously important. That when we read the Bible of James, which is the Bible of Tyndale, we're in touch with 16th century England, which is such a transformative age for this country.
One of the questions points out that you've mentioned the key voices in shaping English today, but you haven't mentioned Coverdale. And they would be interested in hearing your views on Coverdale. You might like to, for those who don't know who Coverdale is, explain who he is.
Coverdale's the chief completer, not the only one at all, but the chief completer of the bits which Tyndale didn't finish. Of course, the Psalms. Tyndale only produced little fragments of the Psalms. Coverdale translated all of them. And those of you who are at Evensong tonight heard Coverdale being sung by the choir. Because interestingly, the Book of Common Prayer, which of course started with pre-King James texts, did not change the Psalter when it was compiled later. In 1662, the last version of the prayer book kept Coverdale in the Psalms. You'll notice it if you put that side by side with the King James Bible. The Psalm 23 is a good one to try. And you see they're different. So clearly the 1662 prayer book people thought there was real value in Coverdale, and he was good. He was an associate of Tyndale. They thought alike, and he's writing this wonderful, simple English, taking a language which is also constructed of simple particles, Hebrew, when Latin is much more inclined to polysyllables. Hebrew and English aren't, at least in those instances.
Another question about Tyndale's life. So someone is asking that they have read that Tyndale was betrayed by someone who he placed trust in Belgium.
Yep.
Is that true? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, I can. The man is called Henry Phillips, and he was the man who basically shopped Tyndale, told the authorities where he was, provided the evidence of what he was doing. Now, this is extraordinary. This man, Henry Phillips, was clearly a crook, but he was a crook who was under the patronage of Thomas Cromwell. And therefore, Cromwell and Tyndale thought he was okay. Cromwell knew his father, and the father had been sort of in the patronage circle of Cromwell. So he's a real turncoat. And he's one of the sort of strands running through the 1530s. You keep spotting him scurrying around the edge of things. And he was in the Low Countries. So Henry Phillips is the baddie, but he is also probably being paid by the then Bishop of London, a man called John Stokesley, who was a strong conservative, not at all liked by Thomas Cromwell. And there is another story there which I think is concealed because it is not very wise to have a public row in front of Henry VIII.
Let's now talk about Anne Boleyn.
Okay.
What part did Anne Boleyn play in supporting Tyndale, and did her downfall have any impact on Tyndale's subsequent downfall?
We have the story from John Fox that she introduced Tyndale's works to the king, and the work she actually gave him was not the Bible, but a work which suggested that the kings of England had a place of their own in God's plan. They should not be subject to the Pope. They had been cheated of their place in the church by wicked papists. And of course, Henry was at the time he was thinking what to do next in the end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s. Thought this was great. This man has the sow by the ear, he's supposed to have said, according to Fox. So she is important in that respect. Later on, it's very difficult to see what her role is. She and Thomas Cromwell did not get on at all. In other words, I think Thomas Cromwell is basically responsible for destroying her. Despite the fact they're both people of the Reformation. Just because you're on the same side doesn't mean you necessarily like the other person. And she, I think, detested Cromwell because she saw him as Cardinal Wolsey's servant. And she thought that Wolsey had been the man stopping her marrying Henry VIII. So it's complicated. And I don't think in the later stages he's really involved in the Tyndale thing.
Another really interesting question is around the church's motivation for prohibiting translation into vernacular. The person asks, what was the doctrinal basis for them doing so?
Well, the doctrinal basis is partly the people who are doing it. People who are saying that the whole structure of the 14th century church is wicked and a cheat. And not surprisingly, if they say that, you are not going to follow their agenda with Bible reading. Someone could have produced a biblical translation into English, but they didn't among the official church. And the very fact of the Lollard Bible was enough, I think, to stop that. There is no doctrinal thing. It's a matter of where the church was.
The motion against the English Bible was so strong from the church authorities, but there doesn't seem to have been a similar move in continental Europe. And could you explain why not?
No Lollards. There simply isn't another movement of dissent anywhere except Bohemia, the Czech Republic that is, and that's the Hussites. Everywhere else, no one saw a problem in translating the Bible. You wouldn't use it in church, but it would be there for people to read. And so this is a peculiarly English problem. And it's part of the measure of England's isolation from the rest of Europe at the time. It's a really remote place with a language that no one else speaks. No one else in Europe spoke English. So there's a very different situation there.
Can we talk a little bit about printing? Because printing is very significant in the production of Tyndale.
Yeah.
Do you think if the printing press hadn't been invented at the time that Tyndale's translation came out, that it would have made a difference to the impact?
Oh, yes. Printing just absolutely changes the scale of how fast you can circulate texts. It's one of the reasons the Lollards didn't succeed is that they couldn't get enough copies out. They're laboriously having to write these by hand. But think of that statistic, 6,000 copies of the first Tyndale New Testament. That's huge. Printing just transforms the scale. And that's, as John Fox pointed out, one of the reasons why the Reformation was a success. It's printing, which of course printing was not the mark of revolution to start with. In the 15th century, the first things to be printed were church texts, liturgical texts, one Latin Bible, the great Gutenberg Bible, but mostly the things which their church would like to use. And it's ironical that the earliest piece of dated printing in this country is an indulgence. 1476. Because, you want lots of indulgences, you print a form, then you write the names in for the people who are buying the indulgence. So it takes someone to say, actually, we could use this for our purposes when the church has already used it.
And what about distribution networks? Because that's the other fascinating thing, is that the New Testaments come in and they were distributed really very successfully around England. How did that happen in the period?
Partly the Lollards, because they're used to being clandestine. They're used to getting their texts around. But not just them. There is a series of people who, like Thomas Cromwell, I think, were in the merchant class, gentry class, who were able to use their trading routes to get this text around. That is why I think Boston is really significant. It's a place far from the London customs officers. And so you can do all sorts of smuggling there, but smuggling here in a good cause. So all the existing commercial links across the North Sea are vital to this process.
So you mentioned in your talk the difference between Thomas More and William Tyndale and how they were poles apart. So there's a question about, can you tell us a little bit more about why they were so different? And also, was there any common ground between them?
The common ground is that they're both humanist scholars. That is, that they're taking on board all the exciting things which are happening in universities about learning, about texts, and that is the commonality. But the trouble is, what is your priority going to be if you're a humanist? Very many humanists were Catholic bishops of the English Church, but some were people like Tyndale, who took texts as the important thing. And in the end, when it came to the clash of the Reformation, Thomas More's stand was that the church is a universal thing. It is not up to any one place to challenge its authority. And Henry VIII challenged its authority. And so the priority is to defend Holy Mother Church, because it is descended from Jesus, and that counteracts any temporary insights you might have about the Bible and its place. So it's a real question of clashing priorities.
Let's talk a little bit about legacy now. I'm imagining Tyndale coming into St Paul's Cathedral and looking at all these people here to hear a talk on his translation. Would he be surprised?
I don't think he would, because he was a believer in divine providence, and he knew he was doing the Lord's work, and here you all are, 500 years later. We have not forgotten him. We have not forgotten his place in the Reformation, even though the Church of England is a rather different place now than it was then. We've also forgotten some of his extraordinary radicalism. He proposed to have Sunday abolished, not in the Bible. So Sunday ought to go. You have a holy day any day of the week to go to church. He believed in a doctrine which Protestants after that thought was heretical, soul sleep. That is, that the soul goes to sleep after death and then waits for the general resurrection. Luther thought the same thing. And this is a big blow against purgatory. So you don't go to purgatory because that's horrid and papism doesn't exist. So what do? You go to sleep. But Protestantism didn't take this up. So his providence is a different one from that which actually happened, but it is still, in a sense, providence, I think.
And there's a similar question about Henry VIII. Did Henry VIII get the Reformation he wanted?
No, Henry VIII did not get the Reformation he wanted, because Thomas Cromwell had his own ideas about Reformation. Henry VIII didn't want a Reformation. He just wanted to be Henry VIII and run things. The more you know about Henry VIII, the less you like him. And the fact is, he was an appalling narcissist. There are other narcissists in politics at the present day. But the one thing you can say about Henry VIII, though a narcissist, he was not a moron. And he did wish to reform the church, but he wanted to reform it as, say, Cardinal Wolsey wanted to reform it, with the big extra reform that he was head of the church, which is a bit of a narcissistic thing to say. Remember, his successors, our present dear monarch, does not call himself supreme head of the church. He calls himself supreme governor of the church, and he was egged on by Queen Elizabeth I in that, who called herself supreme governor, not supreme head. That's a long way of saying something about Henry VIII, but he's a very unpleasant man, but also clearly a charismatic man. He was that definition of a narcissist, someone who can make good people do bad things. And he made Thomas Cromwell do bad things. He made others do bad things. But people wept when he died, as they wept for Joseph Stalin. It happens with narcissists.
I've just had one come in which kind of comes slightly out of the theme we're in, so I'll ask this and then I'll go back to the theme. It's a really interesting question. When copies of Tyndale's Bible were burnt in London, was there any shock, outrage or fear that this was blasphemous? Or was it just accepted?
Very little commentary like that. Obviously, those of the Reformation, such as they were at the time, were shocked. And looking back on it, it was considered extremely shocking. I keep mentioning the 16th century historian John Fox, brilliant historian, and usually very accurate in his narrative, though he doesn't necessarily share our priorities. But Fox makes a big thing of this. He knew what to pick as a shocking thing. But for most citizens of London, they'd have applauded at this wicked heretical text being burnt by their good bishop. And the canons of this cathedral would have certainly, the prebendaries would have said, yes, good thing, good thing.
Not today.
Not today.
Not today. So if someone were tempted to read Tyndale today, would you recommend it as a translation?
Oh, of course. It misses a lot because we know far more about what the Bible actually says in the 21st century than they did. We've got far more manuscripts, far more data. But as a translation of a text, of the text on which the Christian faith sits, it is remarkable. And it's creation of an English, which is a way of expressing a biblical text. It's unparalleled. I recommend it to everybody to read. And you'll be surprised how much, if you know the King James Bible, you'll have met before.
I'm going to end on a spectacularly niche question.
Oh.
Have you got a favourite bit of Tyndale's translation? Favourite word, favourite phrase, something that jumps out to you?
Well, I've mentioned one or two, so I'll stick with them. I do like the fact that he felt that Hebrew and English were close. And there's a characteristic of Hebrew which he brought into his translation, that it tends to create a narrative dynamic by starting a sentence with "and." So it goes on from what's there before and then goes on again and again. I think that's splendid. But I'll probably leave it at that.
In a moment, I will ask you to thank Dermot for me, but let me just give you some final notices. We have been mentioning throughout the evening a Tyndale New Testament that we own here at the cathedral. As Dermot has said, there are only 3 extant in the world, and we are enormously fortunate to have one of them. It is going on display here from June. It isn't quite possible yet to book tickets, but it will be very shortly. I would encourage you very warmly to book to see it. You're probably not all quite as geeky as I am, but when I first saw the Tyndale New Testament, I went into paroxysms of delight. So I would recommend strongly you come and see the exhibition and learn a little bit more. If you don't want to do that, there are a number of events that will be going on during the year to celebrate this 500th anniversary of the translation of the New Testament into English, and I would urge you to come and join us for other events. Allow me now to thank Dermot for his lecture. It was brilliant.